Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I know that everything I'm going to tell you has been told to somebody in bits and pieces, and hopefully if I can make it through, we'll put it all together. And I'm going to talk to you about the history of the church, but I'm also going to talk to you about the history of the area. You can't understand the history of the church unless you understand the history of the area. So we're going to start way back and talk about the history of Black Rock Militia District. This is Black Rock Militia District. The courthouse for the Black Rock Militia District is the little building that's in the edge of the cemetery over there, and it's been there ever since governance was established. Of course, that's not the original building. But anyway, I want to start all the way back from, and this is pertinent to where I'm going. I want to start all the way back to when the area was first settled. At the end of the Revolutionary War, when the districts were laid out, the land was surveyed and into land lots. Land lots here are 202.5 acres. I don't know why that, and in some areas they're different. North Georgia is 140 acres. Out west it's a square mile, which is 640 acres. But anyway, the land lots were laid out, and every Revolutionary War soldier, his wife, and his children were entitled to a land lot. And they were assigned by a lottery. The lottery was held in Richmond, Virginia, and it was a one-time deal. And they pulled out your name, and the land lot matched up with it, and that's what you got. You didn't have any option to go different. Well, you know, very often the land lot would be for somebody that lived in Vermont or Connecticut, and they didn't want the land lot, but more often than not. There's a man came here who still has some folks that in his line around here, some in this room. His name was Herod Thornton. He was Herod with 2 R's. Excuse me. He came in with a little money in his pocket. Now, all those folks received those land lots, and they had to pay $18 to register. Most of them didn't have $18 and didn't really want the land lot. So Mr. Thornton and a few other folks like him, but particularly here, not here, but just north of here, Mr. Thornton would come in, pay their registration, give them $25, $50, and take the deed. Now, if you will start at North Fayette Baptist Church at Long Bridge and go back west along the gas line, and that gas line is pretty much due west to 92 Highway, where the gas line crosses, the Continental Pipeline crosses the highway below the water tower, and then keep going to Whitewater Creek. Then you go up Whitewater Creek to an area past Lee's Mill. You go up Morning Creek to West Bridge, on West Bridge Road. Mr. Thornton owned most of the lots within what I've described to you there, a large portion of North Fayette County. Much like a checkerboard, though. There was lots here and there where somebody else claimed them, but for the most part, he owned those lots. And he is a key figure here in what we're going to talk about in the early days. You know, birds of a feather flock together, and when Mr. Thornton started to try to recruit and bring in families to put one on each one of those land lots, he was a Protestant, a Baptist, and he'd come from England. And most of the early settlers that came from that same background, from England or Ireland. And I'm getting around to New Hope now. In 1825, they built the church somewhere around where the water tank is. I don't know exactly where it is, at Hopeful. It was called the Baptist Church at Hopeful. Somewhere in the next 30 years down the road, that church burned. I don't know exactly where it was, but then they built the current church. It's up at the end of the road. And Mr. Thornton was very instrumental in having that built. As a matter of fact, his son, I read the old deed, and his son, Blackman Thornton, was designated as the first trustee. My Herod Thornton would be my wife's great-grandfather 3 times removed. He would be Janet Coleman's great-grandfather 4 times removed. Is Janice, what's she? No, she's, I'll think of her name, Mathis, Janice Mathis. She's another. But anyway, the church operated there for a long time, and they were all Calvinists now. Well, I won't say all Calvinists, but it was predominantly Calvinist. And somewhere along here in the era after the Civil War, there were a group of folks within the church who didn't agree with the Calvinist theology. And they split off and came down the road and founded New Hope. Now, somewhere in there, the names got switched around, and in the early days, and I remember when it still carried this name, this was known as New Hope Missionary Baptist Church. The old Hopeful Church carried the name of Hopeful Primitive Baptist Church, and there are a lot of folks in that. There are a lot of churches in that denomination that most of them deserted. You know, the Calvinists believe in predestination and didn't get out and recruit anybody. Pretty quick way to go dead. But anyway, the folks who came down here and started New Hope Missionary Baptist Church, and I don't know much about the building, but had a crude building that was used jointly as a school. Now, there were no public schools in this area until somewhere in the early 1900s. My wife's 3 oldest siblings were born in 01, 03, and 05, and they all went to school in a little 14 by 14 building on their family farm, and her aunt taught the children. By the way, that little building is down in Inman at the Heritage Farm. So somewhere along in there in the early 1900s, they started the public school system, and there was a school built down here where the power line crosses New Hope Road, called Black Rock. I'm an honor graduate, 6th grade, Black Rock. The school and the church were so intertwined. It's the same people. They have the same philosophy. They all go to church together and have a common mission, if you please. But anyway, now I'm going to back off and start another subject here and see if I can make it work. Something else that had a huge impact on what went on in this part of the world was one word: cotton. Those folks were drawn here because this was a good area to grow cotton, and a family could grow enough cotton to make a pretty good living. And we had the train. A lot depended on the train. You had a way to ship it out of here. And their fortunes rose and fell with the crops they were able to make, and in particular with the price of cotton. Now, around 1900 and 1902, there was an area of pretty good prosperity. Cotton was bringing a good price. The little white building was built. Lots of the older houses, including the one that I lived in as a boy at the end of the street, built in 1902. And a fair number of churches were built around here. I don't know whether they had a blueprint or maybe they had the same builder, but they're all pretty much the same, looked alike. And I mean, a lot. There were 22 little one-room schoolhouses because the children had to walk to school, of course. And typically there would be a church paired up with that school. Most of them Baptist, 2 or 3 Methodists, one Christian church. But they were all tied together. I had a visitor the other day, had a little 9-year-old boy, as cute as pie, and I was telling about how when I was going to Black Rock, all the children had to walk to school. We didn't have a school bus. And he said, well, why didn't their mom just drive them? Times have changed. But anyway, don't let me get off track. We want to talk about cotton. And it was the rise and fall of this community. It devastated. The effects of cotton devastated this part of the world. After World War I in 17, 18, 20, you could make a bale or a bale and a half of cotton to the acre, and it'd bring 20 cents a pound. That's $100 for a bale of cotton. $100, a good bit of money in those times. Spring forward to 22, when the boll weevils came, and instead of making a bale on an acre, you couldn't make a half a bale on an acre. Production was cut to about 1/3 of what it had been. And then from there, we start to enter the Great Depression. The price of cotton got down as low as 8 or 9 cents a pound. So now this is the only thing that we could grow that would sell, and we had to keep growing it. We were locked in. There was nowhere to go. The one thing we knew how to do was we knew how to feed ourselves. We had a very good handle on the business of growing our food. I don't ever remember any time when Dad, well, you can look at me, I missed many meals. And indeed, a lot of families that had moved into the city had to come back so they could be fed. But a lot of people lost their farms. I'll tell you my family story just as an example. My grandfather was Ira White, bought the land on White Road in 1912, and he was a good farmer, and he'd had some good crop years, and he paid $3,500 for it, 100 acres, and paid it off in a few years. And then my mom and dad got married in 1920, and the farm across the road was for sale. Price of cotton was up there. The price of land rose and fell with the price of cotton. And he helped them buy, actually bought it in his name, the 140 acres is now Victoria Plantation. And he bought it, they bought it in his name because he had standing at the bank, you see. Now the banking regulations, I still miss Ann Lynch back there, she knows all about banking. Banking regulations were very different back then. You could borrow money to buy a farm, but the total balance was due at the end of every crop year. And it was up to the banker as to whether or not he would renew your loan. And very quickly, a lot of people reached the point where the value of the land didn't match the loan, and they lost their land. My grandfather had bought that farm in his name, but the banking laws would also allow you to take the other property that people owned if the land in question didn't equal the loan. And my grandfather knew that, and when things started to go south, he changed his farm over into my grandmother's name. But then, as the times got worse and the folks couldn't make the payment, they lost that 140 acres for a $3,500 debt. Might well have been $3 million. There was no way they were going to pay. Excuse me a minute. I'm getting kind of dry mouth here. And then I got to thinking, and this is I want to set the stage for you to understand the struggles that the New Hope Church family went through. And looking at it through human eyes, there's no way we could be here today. God's hand's been on this church from back when. Here we are with all of these folks who have lost their land. They're still living here, but somebody else owns their land. Now, a fair amount of wealthy folks, and there was a few in the county, played the same tune that the banks played. They would loan money on a farm, and then when times went bad, they'd end up owning the farm. At the end of World War II, an awful lot of land in Fayette County was in about 6, 7 families. But I got to thinking about where the church sits and the area around it, and I know every family and where they live. There was not a single family from New Hope Church to 314 after the Depression that still owned their farm. They were sharecropping or renting or leasing. There was not a family going north on New Hope Road till you get almost to the water tank that owned their land. There was one family on Brogdon Road, none on Neely Road. Start down 92 Highway at the water tank and go from the water tank down to where my grandparents lived on White Road. They managed to hold on to there. Nobody owned their land. Now this is some struggling folks. But you know what? They were bound together. God's people are bound together by adversity. They had one another. They had their faith. They had their neighbors. They had the families, and they made it through. And they maintained the viability of the church. There was spiritual depth that we don't see much today. But anyway, we go forward, if you would, to somewhere in we started, they just had service one time a month. And then somewhere about 1920, started to have services on the second and fourth Sundays, twice a month. Now, my great-grandfather, Thomas A. Knowles, started the first Sunday school right after the old church was built. They strung a wire across the church both ways and put 4 curtains in there that they could slide back and forth, and they had 4 Sunday school rooms. Ladies, men, teenagers, children. For years, we always had Sunday school, but we only had a full church service twice a month. How many of you remember Dr. Harry Smith? Okay, good. Dr. Harry Smith was a pastor in 1920. Married my mom and dad, and he was a student in the School of Theology of Mercer and Macon. Ride the train up here on Saturday, and some family would pick him up and take him. He'd spend the night with them, come preach, put him back on the train Sunday afternoon and go back to Mercer. On the second and fourth, on the first and third Sunday, he preached at Sandy Creek. Come on, it's the same thing. But anyway, I'll say I've got to say a word or two about Dr. Harry. He was a very influential person in this life of this church at a later time. He pastored some of the larger churches around, and particularly First Baptist Church of Forsyth in his ministry time, and he was later vice president of Mercer, and then he headed the Baptist Foundation that manages the money for all of the folks that go to seminary and whatever. But anyway, the church, as and I got to go all the way now to about 1935 before I kick in. I think I am the oldest living member by tenure. I was saved and baptized when I was 10 years old. And I'm 88 now. So that's, 78 years. And I have, everything else is broke, but my memory is still pretty good. I remember very vividly the church. It's been such an important part of my family's life. See, I'm a third generation member. My great grandparents were here, and but the church was alive. It was spiritually alive. It was absolutely unacceptable to have lost people in this neighborhood. They were witnessed to and prayed over until they were won, and it was a time of terrible hardships, but we were all bound together and we made it through. Now, if we could go forward to things when President Roosevelt came in, the first thing he did was shut the banking system down and created the FDIC and reworked all of the rules and regulations to a more realistic level. Things began to improve. They brought in some public works stuff, you know, and people could have a little cash money coming in, which was a rare commodity, if you don't mind. It was very unusual for anybody to have any real cash money. Jimmy Carter's book said that, I believe he said in 1936, the average income for cotton farmers was like $500 a year. And I think that in some years that might have stretched it for us. Let's see if I can get back on track here. I wrote this cheat sheet so I could stay on track. Then comes the Great War, and it changed everybody's lives. We had 44 young men from this church and community that served in World War II. Two of our boys were killed. Linton Tidwell was killed by a sniper in the South Pacific, and Laura Bishop was killed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. But naturally that changed everything. We were all bound together trying to work in the war effort. Lots of people that were able moved out and took wartime type jobs. We came to a point that immediately after the war, things started happening around the south side of Atlanta. Airlines were growing. The Ford plant was built, and the several businesses, and you get a job. So lots of people moved away. Sort of a ghost town. We got down to 2,800 people in this county. And you can imagine what that did to the church. How'd we survive? All those folks who moved to town, got a job, came back on Sunday and went to church and brought money with them. Yeah, they remember. And along in the early 50s, we had some county commissioners and a county manager that were visionaries. They could see that we needed to do something if we were going to survive, and they put on a big drive to pave all of the north-south main roads so you could live here and work in town. The road was so bad that you couldn't have a job in the city and travel. You'd miss half your work days when it rained. But we paved New Hope Road in 1954, 92 Highway in 51, 314 somewhere along in there. Now, State 85 had been, the road bed had been built and the paving had been done before the war started. But then before they got the bridges built, they couldn't get steel to build the bridges with. So you could drive from creek to creek, but if you wanted to go any further, you had to swim. And so we had the bridges completed there, you see, and so that we could make our way into town and have a job. And this is where things began to happen at New Hope Baptist Church. We're sitting here with a little white building, been there all these years, served us well, and we had a family on every 100 acres, few on 50 acres. And we wake up one morning and realize that we don't have a family on every 2 acres. Clarence Tucker was our pastor. He was a good man. Could have stayed. He'd been here 6, 7 years. Could have stayed as long as he wanted to. But he too was a visionary. He realized that he didn't have the education, he didn't have the leadership skills to take us where we had to go. So he came to leadership of the church and said, you need somebody with a higher level of leadership skills than I have to lead you, because you've got to make some major changes. And I'm going to resign and let you find that person. Excuse me a minute. And here comes somebody I bet none of you, or maybe one or two of you might have heard of. There was an extremely influential person in the life of New Hope Baptist Church. Quentin, you may remember Dr. Farr, the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Forest Park for 28 years. Dr. Farr had been the pastor of Forest Park Church when that was just a farming community, just a wide spot in the road. And of course, Forest Park was the first community that just really blew up after the war. And he led that church for I think 28 years, from about what we had here in the little white building to a 3,000 member church. He'd had a heart attack, had to retire, but he'd recovered to a level that he agreed to come and serve as our interim. And he brought that wealth of knowledge with him, you see, that he had used or had seen used to build that church. Very plain spoken, great big old man, had a hand big as a $10 ham, and he could, when you shook hands with Dr. Farr, you know you'd been shook. But he'd tell it like it was, and he'd get us all to call us boys. We were fairly young punks, I guess. He'd say, boys, what you got to do is you got to be willing to change. You've got to be able to move away from your comfort zone and change and do what it takes to reach the folks that's moving into this neighborhood. Said if you don't do it, said it'll be a mission spring up out here, and these people will all go to church there. He said God's work's going to go on. And he said if you want your church to thrive and grow, then you're going to have to make some changes. So here we come now with we have a search team out looking for a pastor. Now there was protocol. I guess it's supposed to be observed in Larry. I guess it's still observed in some of these churches. The search team does not get out and seriously recruit anybody, because they have a job and their church don't want you there. By the same token, pastors that are interested in your job don't want to come out openly and say so. They send some friend over to whisper in your ear and say he might be interested, because they don't want his church to know he's looking for a job. So, isn't that the way it worked? Well, anyway, I'm out working in my yard one day, and here comes a young fellow up in a car, and he gets out, and I knew him as Richard Lee. Richard had done a couple of revivals here, and they'd been very successful. He and Judy traveled all over the country. And he said, I hear you folks looking for a pastor, and I want to apply for the job. Well, he had never pastored, but he had been an associate pastor of a rather large church. His dad was a pastor. His older brother was a pastor. And the people knew them and liked them, and that was an obvious fit right from the beginning, and things began to change. We outgrew that building in a very short period of time, and we had to come to a point now. This is where you got to either fish or cut bait. We had to build a building. Now, this church family still didn't have money in it. Give you a little feel for how much money we had. I was promoted to foreman at Delta Airlines, in 1966, and my beginning pay was $685 a month. You know, no money. And that's probably was in the top 5 in the church family. But here we are faced with having to borrow money, and never borrowed money, having to borrow money to build a building. Now, this is Building B. You know, here, I don't know how we got it named Building B, but we got a set of plans, had some folks bid on it. Johnny Picklesheimer bid $192,000 to build the building. We had put together the 42, so we had to go down to the bank and borrow 150. Church had never been incorporated, so those of us who signed for the loan were actually putting up our own property for it. But that $150,000 looked big as elephants here, you know. It was spooky. But, you know, we built that building, moved in it, had to go to 2 services immediately. We never thought we'd fill it up, you know. And I was church treasurer at the time, and we had a loan. I guess this is sort of a standard loan, like they had a 20-year loan. And you pay most of the interest on it. You pay mostly interest early on. And at every business meeting, I would tell them, we've paid this many loans, and you can pay an extra loan next month for this many dollars. You know, principal only. And we'd have families and Sunday school classes, and folks go together and pay those extra. We paid the bill all 3 years. Built Building B. The first Building B was built in Building A. Building A was built in 2 phases. We built the first part of it. Now I got to integrate passages here with the building, and at the end I want to go through land procurement with you, if I may. Oh my goodness, time's getting away. Y'all put that clock back there especially for me, didn't you? We were sailing along here, doing what we thought was very well, and one day Richard comes up and said, Judy and I feel like that our call is evangelism, and we're going to resign, and we'll be gone in a couple of weeks. Well, that hit like a pile of bricks, you know, and we were really struggling to figure out what to do. Now, one of the deals that Richard made with us when he came is he had not finished his college training, so he wanted to go to Mercer and finish his degree, and we agreed to that. And he had met a lot of folks there, and he brought down a young fellow to be a summer intern named Ike Riker. Ike was a piece of work. He had been saved after he'd married Cindy, didn't grow up in church. He'd been a disc jockey in Atlanta, flunked out of college twice. But anyway, he'd managed to get back in Mercer. Y'all have heard the Gene Hendricks story. I wish I had a little more time. I've got to tell you this story. After Ike was saved, he felt like he was called to preach, and he went over and applied at Mercer to try to get back in college, and his previous history was so bad that they wouldn't even talk to him. And he said he was sitting on the steps between levels of college, just sitting there contemplating, what do I do next? You know, the admissions board had just turned him down. And a lady came along, and I don't know whether I can tell this. A lady came along and said, you look terribly distressed, what's wrong? And he told her, he said, I've been called to preach, and my previous scholastic history is so bad that I can't get accepted. And she said, well, come in my office. The lady was Gene Hendricks, who was a dean, and she also was a professor. She signed him up. She put him in a class. This class had Richard Lee, Ike, Barry Thompson, my son-in-law, Lee Ross. Ike introduced my children. He's still trying to collect the finder's fee. Larry Wynn, where Miss Rosemary goes to church out in Decula. Frank Cox, who later became editor of the Christian Index, and several others. I can't remember. Three people in that class later became president of Georgia Baptist Convention. That lady built a fire under that bunch of preacher boys, and they had a tremendous impact just from that one life, you see. But anyway, Ike was here, green. Kids loved him. I never heard him preach. Richard didn't give up his pulpit to anybody, and I'd never heard him preach. But he had got lined up, was doing a lot of services with youth groups around, and a couple of guys. I see Ken Turner grinning back there. A couple of guys that drove the bus said, "Hey," he said, "that kid can preach." He said, "You ought to at least, while you're in such a crack here with nobody, you ought to at least let him preach a few Sundays, and maybe some small church will call him and give him a start." Well, we did. Now, this is way outside the guidelines, Larry. This isn't the way you do it. You don't bring along some green associate pastor and make him the pastor of a big church. We had 75 people saved in the first 90 days. Gail Hart backed me up against the wall there one Sunday and said, "Are y'all blind?" I said, "You got your man." And she's right. And 17 years later, it was very evident that we had the man. Ike stayed 17 years. Left to go be the associate pastor of First Baptist Church of Atlanta with a deal that Dr. Stanley was going to retire in 1 year. And Ike was going to be hit. We all know how that turned out. Ike's going to always land on his feet. He'd been president of the convention, and he knew everybody. Brought up the North Star Church out of the ground as a finished product with a full staff, still going strong, with one of our boys as its pastor, and Lynch's son, Chuck's son, Mike. But anyway, let's get off of that a little bit. I got to get back into the church. Had a search team. I declined to serve on it. I'd served on 3 in a row, and I've always prayed that God would give me the wisdom to do the best I could do in any leadership role, and to give me the good sense to know when it's time to step aside. So I said, "Look, we got to spread this out a bit. I can't serve." So Rich Terry chaired that, and they had a lot of good candidates. And here we're going outside the guidelines again. John Avant was one of those candidates, and they broke off negotiations with him. He decided that he wasn't interested. But they had interviewed several people, and the lady who was being the clerk for the group hadn't made a mistake since 1936. But she put the wrong letter in a letter to John Avant she sent John Avant a letter with a rejection letter, which wasn't true. He hadn't been rejected. He'd been declined, of somebody else's name on it. Well, he did the right thing. He picked up the phone and called Rich Terry and said, "You need to get this straightened out and get the right guy notified." And that started the conversation back up again with John Avant, and he ended up coming over here and being our pastor. All our pastors brought us something different. John Avant got us focused on mission work, got us focused on growth, and he was involved in mission work to Belarus and then later to Wales. Rich Terry again. Rich Terry was, he's a pilot, and he would have layovers in London, and somebody told him he ought to go down to Holland Road in, what is it, something Hope, Pride and Hope. There's a young man down there that was an outstanding pulpiteer. So he went down in there, he hooked up with Reese. So, John, I don't remember exactly how long John Avent stayed, 6, 7 years. And when he left to be vice president, how long?
I think it was
7 years, thank you. When he left, what was then the Home Mission Board asked him to come be the vice president. And when he left, Prescott came and led us and did a good job as an interim. What's his first name? But anyway, they put the search team together, and I again had said I didn't want to serve. And after they put it together, the chairman and a couple of folks came to see me and said, "We have a very inexperienced search team, and would you just come and sit with us and help out if you can?" And I said, "Of course." We had a lot of good names. We struggled. We really struggled. Here comes Rich Terry again. He wrote us a letter. He said, "I know it doesn't make a bit of sense, but," he said, "I just feel like I ought to turn into you the name of Rich Terry. Of Reese Stenner from the Holland Road Church in England." Well, we'd heard Reese preach. He'd been here several times, and Larry knew him. And but of course, initially it was just too big a shock. They couldn't listen to it. But eventually, the negotiations got a little warmer, and got to a point where we wrote him a letter, a 2-page letter of questions. Theological questions, and about his style of leadership and everything that you want to know about where a pastor is going to lead you. And we had 2 weeks later, we got his answer back, and we all came in and sat down around the table, and the chairman passed out copies of his reply, and we all just sat there shell-shocked. He hit everything right on the button. I've never seen a room full of people so bound together by just reading an answer to a letter. Every one of us knew at that time that we had our man. The rest is history so far as pastors are concerned. You know from here. Now, I want to go back, if I may. All a part of this is you've got to have the resources to grow. You've got to have land. And we have procured the land for this and the South Campus in ways I'll tell you, and you can decide if you want to believe. There are 18 deeds to this North Campus property. It's 96 acres. Yeah, 18 deeds. 6 deeds to the cemetery. A couple of them just to sort out landline. You got to remember, we started with an acre. Miss Pamela Graves, and I want to speak to the Graves family, if I may. The Graves family, never been members of this church, but they've been one of the greatest benefactors of anybody to this church. This was Graves' land. Miss Pamela Graves, who was the title holder at the time, gave an acre for the first building and put a caveat in there that there could not be a cemetery. Some 2 or 3 years later, Mr. Oscar Kilgo died. He's their neighbor and friend, and the family wanted to bury him here, and she relented and gave us another acre for the church. For the cemetery. And incidentally, all of you need to know this. I don't think many people church. We now own the property that's behind the little white building, that grove. It had belonged to the county all those years because of its place there on the militia district courthouse. And we tried for years to get it, and we couldn't. The politicians don't want to give away the county's land, Mike blew the vote. But They came a few years ago and said we needed a place to put the tornado warning siren, and you have the highest elevation in the area, and would you deed us enough land for that? And we said, yeah, if you would deed us the property. And Gene Barber knows the ins and outs of the county, and he put all that together and made it work. But we now have, at the rate we're using it, we have enough for the next 50 years, so don't be in a hurry. From there, you got to remember now, everybody's coming to church in a buggy or a wagon. Didn't need much land around the church. We had to be careful when we took out those first big trees because they all had horseshoes and rings nailed to them where they tied up the mules and the horses, the buggy, you see. But as more people got cars, we needed some more land, and we went to Mr. Gray's, and he gave us room to park on the other side. When he died, then we built a little pastorium that sat right out the front here, and we needed a little more land. He gave us some more. When he died, his heirs came to us and said, we're going to divide up the estate, and do you want the money? And we got real bold. We said, yeah, we want 5 acres in the corner. Paid them $1,200 for it. Well, it worked out that there wasn't much room between our back and the landline, and so eventually we were able to, and the rest of what was surrounded was inherited by Miss Kathleen Gray's boy, who just died recently. So Mr. and Ms. Boyd worked with us on the rest of the land. We procured it in 4 different deals, and they'd always let us pay for it as we wanted, as we could, and then pick up another piece. But every time we needed to build a building, we already had the land. Now, the farm, what we call the farm back there, the 68 acres in the back, man on that didn't like us very much. He thought we polluted his lake and all sorts of things. And we tried to buy a little strip back there to try to for a buffer. His answer was, I wouldn't sell New Hope Baptist Church a wheelbarrow full of my dirt. That was his attitude. But then one day, the Lord led him and his wife up into the mountains of North Georgia, and they saw a farm they just had to have. And he come in and Ike's office and said, I'm ready to sell, and here's the price. Ike said, we'll take it. No negotiations, no confirmation, no nothing. And it was just at the time that Eastern Airlines had gone under in the summer, we were beginning to hurt a little bit. We always had plenty of money to pay our bills, but we didn't have any at the time. But we put that together and paid for that. And we could not have built the current worship center without it, because the current worship center has an 8-acre leach field for the septic tank. We didn't have 8 acres. Like I always said, our main claim is that we're the largest church in the United States on a septic tank. I'm sorry, I just get dried out here. But anyway, we procured that, and we got little bits and pieces. Ann Graves Lawton, I've never told anybody this story. I probably shouldn't tell y'all. Ann Graves Lawton inherited the little field over here where we have the garden, 5 acres. She came to us one day and said, I've had an offer. An extended family wants to buy that land and want to put 3 houses on it. And they've offered us $75,000 for it. And she said, we're trying to move from where we live and build another house. And we need the money. But we wanted to offer you the first chance at it. Well, again, this was a time when we didn't have any surplus money. And my wife came up with the idea. She said, it's hard for a big church to be a good neighbor. We don't need 3 houses on that, we're noisy and loud, and yeah, our kids make a lot of noise. But anyway, she came up with the idea, said, let's find 15 families that'll put and they told us you can have 5 years to pay for it. And she said, let's find 15 families that'll all go in, we'll put $1,000 a piece a year in it, and we'll buy it. So that was easy. I know Larry was in it. I don't remember who all was in. Several folks in here was in. Well, Harold would send us. We all paid the first 1,000 and the second 1,000, and no notice came for the third. And that's unlike Harold. If you had money due in, he's going to let you know. And I didn't get a notice from Harold. I said, "What happened? I haven't heard from you on the land deal." He said, "Oh, it's been paid for." And this is the unlikely part. He said Newt Gingrich and Mary Ann was going to church here at the time. That's long before he converted to Catholicism. Anyway, he said Newt Gingrich has some speaking fees. They can only keep so much of their speaking fees. They had to put somewhere, and he came here and offered it for anything we wanted to do. And he said he put up the extra, the other $45,000, paid it off. So thank you, Newt. But anyway, but lots of things. I see some South Campus folks here, and I've just got to put the South Campus story out there if I can be a little bit abbreviated with it. Rick Nixon and Mr. Banks, what's his name? Wendell Banks. Worked to make us aware of the struggles of the Stars Mill Church, and they asked us to come down and join them and be a part of them, and then we made a deal just to incorporate them as a second campus for our church. We needed land to build a building. I don't know whether maybe some of you know, I believe the old building was on 6 acres, which wasn't enough, and some of that's in a floodplain. And we tried to find land, and up on the north side of 74, there was a lady that had another 8 acres that she wanted to sell. Her husband was ill, and she needed the money. But there was a 1 acre lot between what we owned and what she owned. We went to see the man that owned the 1 acre lot, and he said, I'll give you the lot. Well, then his children got involved in it, said, no, we won't give it away and we won't sell it. So we stuck. Somebody said, oh, there's 68 acres across the road over there for sale. It belonged to, jointly owned by a man and the widow of his previous business partner. He was willing to sell, and she said, this is my retirement. I'm holding this for my retirement. So we sent Billy Garrison, some of y'all remember Billy Garrison, he was an actuary. Sent Billy down, and he did the numbers for her, and land was bringing a pretty good price. And they said, if we pay you the appraised price now, and you put this money in maybe some tax-free municipal bonds or something like that, and as you go towards your retirement date, you're likely to have more money than you'll have if you hold the land to sell it. So she agreed to sell. The other owner said, well, if y'all will give me a tax credit, I will, for half of it, I will sell it to you for half price. So he sold us his half for half price. Then he came back later and made a gift that was pretty much the equivalent of the rest of it. So we ended up with a beautiful piece of land that we have down there, and we wanted to have access to 85 highway. We always wanted to have access to the highway. And there was, in the downturn, there was a 28-acre plot between the church property and the highway that had been zoned and plotted for a subdivision. And it had 3 owners, had 2 major owners and 1 minor owner, and we thought we had a deal where we were going to trade them our 6 acres in the corner and then pay them a couple $100,000, maybe $300,000 for it, and the person that owned the minor share wouldn't agree, so we had to drop it. Well, they come along and start that subdivision. They come to us and say, hey, we're going to put a street here, and we know y'all want a street into your campus, and we'll give you the street if you'll pave it. So, of course, we said yes. And then one of our folks gave $50,000 to pay. So it can't happen that way, folks. God's hands on this church. It's always been. It's always done the things that didn't look like it was possible to do. But that's all behind us. That's in the past. And we've got to look forward. There's a lot more to do out there, And let me just say, I was involved with the finances of the church for 55 years. I was church treasurer for 20 years and then served on the finance team for 35 years. And over those years, I always, and in my human reaction, there have been so many times when something would happen that I would think, oh boy, we're in trouble now. We'd have a family move away as a big contributor. Or we Baptists always got to have a little fuss once in a while where half a dozen families would leave. But the backfield was always there. The backfield was always there. We didn't miss a beat. And it's still there. And we just had our best year, by the way. So, I've lived a long time and I've seen a lot happen. But I always want to go back to that passage in Joel that says, old men dream dreams and young men have visions. Don't be afraid to incorporate the younger folks into your leadership. That's where your visions come from. And now I can see it. See, I wouldn't be enthusiastic about joining into something that I couldn't do my part down the way. That's the way it works. But I'm so pleased with where we are and what we do, and you all are so special. This church family has always been so special, so bound together. We're bound together in hard times. We're bound together in good times. I thank you for letting me do this. I hope you've learned something, and it's all good. It's all good.